AITA for feeling like it's not my job to make sure all the kids at my ex's house have just as much as our two sons. He says I have to take care of all the kids equally or his girlfriend's kids will get offended. My name is Lauren, I am 29, and for the past few years I have carried the kind of quiet exhaustion that sits in your shoulders even when you are lying down. I have two boys, Caleb who is 8 and Mason who is 6, and they are the only reason I stay upright most days. Their dad, Eric, and I split up a while ago. We have shared custody on paper, but anyone who has lived through this sort of arrangement knows that the schedule on paper and the schedule in real life are two very different things. The day-to-day responsibilities always drift back to me like a tide coming in no matter how many boundaries I try to set. Eric has been living with his new girlfriend, Jenna, for a little over a year. She has two kids, Bryce who is 10 and Lily who is 7. I do not have any issue with blended families in general, and in a perfect world kids would just fit together like puzzle pieces and everyone would cooperate and support each other. But the reality is messy, especially when adults do not act like adults. Over the last few months, my boys started coming home from Eric's place with little comments that I tried to brush off. Caleb would say things like, "Dad says we should all have the same toys so no one gets jealous," and Mason would follow with something like, "Dad said you should buy for everyone because we do not want anyone upset." At first I assumed they misunderstood. Kids mix things up, especially when adults tell them things they do not fully understand themselves. I figured Eric probably said something general like, "We all share here," or "Let's try to be fair," and the kids ran with it. But then one afternoon when I was doing the handoff, Eric leaned against his car with that casual posture he uses when he is about to say something irritating but pretending it is reasonable. He told me it would be more fair if, since I was already buying things for Caleb and Mason, I also bought the same things for Bryce and Lily so everyone stayed on equal footing. He said it like it was obvious, like it was the natural next step in this whole co-parenting situation, and I remember just staring at him for a second because I genuinely could not tell if he was joking or if he had somehow lost his grip on reality. I told him I was not their mom and I was not responsible for maintaining the emotional climate of his new household. I said it calmly, the way you speak when you already know a fight would be pointless. He got defensive and said I was creating conflict because my kids show up with nicer things. I did not even dignify that with an argument, because I knew if I continued the conversation I would end up saying something I would regret. What I did not say out loud was the thing sitting in the back of my throat. The reason my kids often have nicer things is because I work 2 jobs and stretch every dollar like it is elastic. Meanwhile, Eric struggles to keep up with his child support payments and treats budgeting like it is an optional hobby. But I bit my tongue. I figured it was better to keep the peace for the boys. I let it go. Or at least I tried to. Then last weekend, when my boys came home, Mason was unusually quiet. He clung to my arm the way he does when something has really bothered him but he is not sure if he will get in trouble for telling me. When I finally got him to talk, he said that Lily had taken his new toy car because Mom Lauren did not buy her one too. She did not ask. She just took it. And apparently no adult in the house stepped in to correct that. Later that night, Eric sent me a message saying it was less drama for everyone if I simply made the gifts equal from now on. He phrased it like he was doing me some kind of favor by offering this brilliant solution, and I felt that familiar mix of frustration and disbelief rise in my chest again. I do not feel obligated to bankroll someone else's kids, especially when those kids have 2 adults already responsible for them. I take care of my own kids because that is my job, and I do it well even when it drains me. But Eric has twisted it into this story where I am the problem, where I am selfish, where I am somehow undermining the harmony of his new family by not expanding my budget to accommodate children who are not mine. I keep replaying everything, trying to figure out if I missed something obvious or if I am being unfair without realizing it. But every time I go through the details again, I end up in the same place. I provide for my kids. He provides for his. That is how this works. That is how it has always worked. But he's acting like I'm the one ruining the harmony in his new family. Am I the asshole? Update 1. I figured he would cool off after our argument, mostly because that was the pattern with him in the past. He would push an idea way too far, I would shut it down, he would huff and puff for a day or two, and then he would quietly drop it once he realized I was not budging. I assumed this situation would follow the same path. I was wrong. Instead of letting it go, he doubled down in a way that was so absurd I still catch myself shaking my head over it. On Friday, he picked up the boys like normal. I packed their usual weekend things, reminded them to grab their jackets because the weather was all over the place, and watched them climb into the back seat of his car. Everything looked completely ordinary, so I thought that was the end of it. A couple of hours later, I checked my phone and saw a message from him. He had written, "Do not forget to buy snacks for all 4 kids, Bryce and Lily like the same granola bars," as if this was some shared plan we had discussed before, as if I had ever agreed to become the personal supplier for children who are not mine. I stared at the message, and the strangest thing happened. I actually laughed. Not because it was funny, but because the situation had tipped so far into ridiculous territory that laughing was the only thing I could do to avoid losing my mind. It was this dry, shocked laugh, the kind you let out when someone crosses a line with such confidence that you have to take a second to process that they really meant it. I was furious underneath, but the sheer audacity pushed me into this weird mix of anger and disbelief. I did not buy anything. I refused to participate in whatever fantasy version of co-parenting he had created where I was supposed to feed, clothe, supply, and soothe 2 additional children simply because he had decided that his convenience mattered more than my boundaries. I went about my weekend and waited for the fallout. On Sunday evening, the boys came back to me, and I could tell instantly that something had been brewing. Mason was dragging his backpack across the floor in that defeated way he does when he feels like he might get blamed for something that was never his fault. He tugged on my sleeve and told me, in this tiny voice, that their dad had been mad because I did not buy snacks for everyone and that he had been forced to buy them himself. He said it like he was confessing something serious, like the world had tilted a little and he was unsure how to interpret it. I asked him why that was even an issue, because in my mind the logic was so simple it barely needed explaining. Caleb, who always takes on the role of mediator even though he is only 8, chimed in and said their dad told them that Jenna should not have to pay for them because they are his kids, and that I could share by helping out with snacks for the whole group. Hearing my son repeat that logic with total sincerity made something in my chest burn. So let me get this straight. His girlfriend should not spend her money on my children, but I should spend mine on hers. According to him, the responsibility only flows in one direction, and it is always toward me. No. Absolutely not. I refuse to twist myself into a financial pretzel just to make his household look evenly supported from the outside. I texted him and spelled out what should have been obvious: I provide for my children. If he wants perfect harmony and matching granola bars across 4 kids, then he can earn enough or budget enough to make that happen without dragging me into it. I told him I was not responsible for subsidizing his girlfriend's kids and that I was done entertaining these conversations. He replied with another message, one that made me stop in the middle of my living room and just stare at the screen because it was so calculated. He wrote, "We'll see how greedy you feel when the boys start asking why you don't care about the other kids," and the smugness behind it was almost tangible. At the time, I didn't know what he meant. Update 2. A week later everything shifted, and it happened so quietly at first that I almost missed it. Caleb is usually the kind of kid who narrates his whole day without taking a breath, but that week he barely spoke. He answered questions with one-word replies, kept his eyes fixed on the floor, and moved around the house like he was trying not to disturb anything. At dinner he just pushed his food around the plate, and when I asked if something happened at school, he shrugged in that half-hearted way kids do when they are overwhelmed but do not know how to explain it. I pressed gently, the way I always do with him, and after a long silence he finally whispered that his dad told them I did not like Bryce and Lily because they were not my kids. Hearing that come out of his mouth felt like someone had grabbed the back of my neck and forced me underwater. I stood there frozen, because suddenly all the weird comments, all the sudden tension, all the careful distance he had been keeping started aligning in the worst possible way. Eric had not just been complaining about fairness to me. He had been feeding the kids these ideas deliberately, planting guilt like a seed and waiting for it to grow into pressure he could use. That was the moment something in my chest locked into place. I had known he was pushing, but I did not realize he had crossed into manipulating the boys directly. I confronted him over text because I did not trust myself to stay calm on the phone. I told him to stop dragging the kids into something that belonged between adults. He fired back with, "If I cannot teach the kids about fairness, they will grow up selfish like you." Reading that felt like someone had flicked the switch off inside me. There was this heavy, sinking certainty that he was not going to stop until he bent the situation into the shape he wanted. Calling my lawyer felt like the sensible next step, even though I already knew the odds. I explained what was happening, how he was telling the kids things that were not true, how he was using emotional pressure to push financial responsibilities onto me, and how unfair and disruptive this was becoming. The lawyer was sympathetic, but in that measured way professionals have when they know the answer you want is not the one they can give. He said there was nothing actionable, nothing that a judge would respond to unless it escalated into something more visible. Words and influence are hard to prove in court, and unless Eric slipped up in some undeniable way, this was still seen as a parenting disagreement, not a legal violation. The next Friday, when Eric came to pick up the boys, I walked them out like I always do. They climbed into the car, Mason chattering about some school project he was excited about. I was buckling his jacket when I heard Eric, not even bothering to lower his voice, tell him to ask me for new sneakers and to make sure he mentioned that Bryce needed a pair too so I would not say no. He said it so casually, like he was instructing the kid on how to tie his shoes instead of teaching him how to manipulate his own mother into spending money on someone else's child. I froze mid-movement, the zipper still in my hand. There was something so brazen about it that my brain lagged behind reality for a second. He was coaching my 6-year-old on how to guilt-trip me, using the same tone you would use to remind a kid to bring their lunchbox home. I did not even step closer or interrupt because the shock hit first, this wave of disbelief that made everything feel slow and oddly muffled. The boys hopped into the back seat, not realizing anything had happened, and Eric drove off like it was a perfectly normal interaction. I stood by the window shaking. Update 3. A few days after the tablet incident, I thought the tension might settle a little, or at least level out long enough for everyone to breathe. Instead, the situation twisted into something harsher and more deliberate, as if Eric had taken my refusal as a personal challenge he refused to lose. It was the kind of escalation that does not happen suddenly with shouting or slamming doors but creeps in through small, methodical shifts that only make sense once you step back and see the whole picture. On Wednesday, during the handoff, he arrived with that smug expression he gets when he has decided he is winning some imaginary competition. It was the kind of look that made me feel like he had been planning something and was waiting to see how long it would take me to notice. He barely said anything, just smiled in this tight, satisfied way and drove off. I brushed it off at first, thinking he was just trying to provoke me into reacting, but that evening Caleb quietly filled in the pieces that made everything click. He said Eric and Jenna had gathered all 4 kids in the living room for what they called a family meeting. The phrase alone made my skin crawl, because I could already imagine the staged seriousness of it, the way Eric gets when he decides he is the wise guide of the household. According to my son, they sat the kids down and explained that real families share everything and that I was making things harder on everyone because I refused to participate. Hearing that secondhand, imagining my boys sitting there while 2 adults tried to rewrite what a family is supposed to mean, made something inside me crack. It was not dramatic or loud. It was the quiet, exhausted snap that happens when your last bit of patience dissolves and the only thing left is the truth you have been avoiding. This was no longer about toys or snacks or shoes. This was about control. After that so-called meeting, the changes came rapidly and in ways I did not expect. Suddenly the boys were coming home with new rules that had nothing to do with me and everything to do with punishment disguised as fairness. They were told they were not allowed to bring certain toys back and forth anymore because it made Bryce and Lily feel bad. The kids believed it was just a new house rule, but the wording told me exactly where it came from, especially when Caleb mentioned that Jenna had said a good mom would understand that. It was subtle, just sharp enough to land, the kind of comment meant to wedge doubt and guilt into a child's mind. The cherry on top was Mason saying, Jenna said you just don't like her kids because they're not yours. Update 4. A few days later everything hit a point where I just could not keep swallowing it anymore. There is a specific kind of fatigue that settles into you when the people around you keep pushing and pushing, assuming you will fold the way you always have, assuming you will bite your tongue, suit the situation, smooth the edges, accept the nonsense. Watching my boys come home confused, missing belongings, trying to repeat rules they clearly did not understand, rules designed to corner them emotionally and make them feel responsible for adults' decisions, that was the breaking point. Something in me simply shut off. Not in a chaotic, explosive way, but in that cold, steady way where you finally stop caring about being the reasonable one. I was tired of being polite. Tired of pretending any of this was normal. Tired of being the person expected to absorb chaos like it was part of my job description. So when Friday rolled around and Eric came to pick up the boys, I reached that quiet clarity that happens when frustration turns into resolve. I followed his car. I did not rev my engine or tail him dramatically, I just trailed behind at a normal distance, letting the decision settle into my bones. I was not trying to spark a fight or do anything reckless. I just needed to see with my own eyes what was going on inside that house, because hearing filtered pieces from my children was no longer enough. Sometimes you reach a moment where logic and exhaustion collide, and all that is left is the need for truth. I parked a little down the street and sat there for a moment with my hands on the steering wheel, feeling my heartbeat in a strange, steady way. I took one breath, then another. I was not planning a confrontation. I was simply done waiting for someone else to fix what was unraveling. When I finally stepped out of my car and walked toward the house, I caught sight of Caleb on the porch. He was standing stiffly, like he did not know whether to go inside or wait. Mason was behind him, trying to hold onto his backpack while Bryce tugged on the other strap like it belonged to him. That image, that tiny tug-of-war over something my child owned, snapped whatever was left of my hesitation. I walked straight up the path and pushed the door open without knocking. I did not raise my voice. I did not barge in wildly. I just walked inside like I belonged there, like this was not the 100th boundary I had been forced to defend. Eric froze mid-step. Jenna froze beside him, clutching something in her hand like she had been in the middle of lecturing someone. The kids froze in that tense cluster children make when they sense adults are about to clash. But I did not give anyone time to react. I stepped farther inside and announced that I was there to pick up what belonged to my children, all of it. The air in the room tightened immediately. You could practically feel the discomfort ripple through the space. Eric's expression shifted into that incredulous disbelief people get when the person they expect to stay quiet suddenly stops playing along. Jenna looked like she had just swallowed something sour and could not decide whether to spit it out or pretend it was fine. But I stayed calm. I did not respond to their faces. I focused on my boys. Caleb's shoulders dropped in visible relief, like he had been holding something heavy for too long and someone had finally lifted it. Mason's eyes widened just enough to show that he understood something important had shifted, something that meant I was not letting anyone walk over us anymore. I picked up the boys' backpacks first and checked them, taking mental inventory of what should be inside and what was clearly missing. Then I asked the boys where the rest of their things were. They pointed to different rooms without hesitation, as if they had been silently hoping someone would finally come reclaim what kept disappearing into the ether of sharing rules. Eric's face grew redder with each step I took, as though my calmness was more offensive to him than any screaming could have been. He kept opening and closing his mouth like he wanted to say something authoritative and reasonable, but nothing came out. Jenna hovered behind him, tense and indignant, clearly not used to someone stepping into her neatly controlled system and refusing to play along. I did not acknowledge either of them. I did not ask for permission to enter rooms. I did not explain myself. I followed the boys' small, certain gestures and collected every item that belonged to them, placing each one into a bag without comment. There was something strangely grounding about the process, simple, straightforward, undeniable. Update 5. The house was so quiet while I worked my way from room to room that the silence felt physical, like another piece of furniture wedged between us. You could hear every small sound I made, zippers closing, toys clinking together, the soft shuffle of my kids hovering behind me. Jenna tried to speak once, something clipped and irritated about how I was making things harder for everyone, but she cut herself off when she realized I was not even turning my head in her direction. Whatever she thought she could say to guilt me or slow me down no longer had a place in the conversation. Eric was pacing in the hallway like a man who had lost track of the script he expected me to follow, muttering about rules and boundaries as if repeating those words would bring back the version of me who used to apologize for things I did not do. None of it mattered. I was not there to negotiate. I was not there to soothe his ego or reassure anyone that their comfort still came before my son's well-being. I was there to gather the pieces of my children that they had been quietly taking, their sense of security, their possessions, their confidence that the adults around them were safe and fair. Every item I placed in the bags felt like reclaiming something that had been slipping through the cracks for far too long. Once everything was loaded into my car, I told the boys it was time to get their coats. They sprinted to the hallway with this mixture of relief and adrenaline, as if they had been waiting weeks for someone to open a door that had started to feel locked. Eric moved to stand in the doorway like he could physically stop the momentum of this shift. His face was caught between anger and disbelief, and for a moment he looked like a man who had realized too late that the one tool he relied on, my willingness to bend, was gone. I looked him in the eyes and told him the simplest truth I had spoken throughout this whole ordeal, the truth that summed up everything that brought me to that point. I was done playing the part he wanted. And I meant every single syllable. It was not a threat, not a performance, not an emotional burst. It was a statement of fact. He stepped aside because he could see it, too. There was no argument left that would work on me. After that day, the entire dynamic changed. The boys stopped bringing special toys to his house, not because I told them not to, but because they were tired of watching their things disappear into someone else's version of fairness. They protected their belongings the way children do when they finally understand that adults are not always good at protecting things for them. I did not chase after Eric's guilt-tripping messages anymore. I did not respond to the comments meant to poke at my conscience. I treated it all like background noise, like distant traffic you get used to ignoring. Eric and Jenna kept trying for a while. They tested the waters with little comments, subtle digs, and small attempts at pushing old patterns. But the energy they relied on was gone. They were not talking to the same woman anymore. The person who used to absorb everything in silence had been replaced by someone who would park her car, walk through their front door, and retrieve what belonged to her without asking for permission. They knew it, and the shift in their behavior proved it. I became the adult who defends her kids, not the one who absorbs everyone else's problems just to keep the peace. And honestly, that was all I needed.